Greetings. I'm speaking today on June 13th of 2020. Happens to be a Sabbath. We've had a service in the morning, and I refer to the fact that tomorrow, June 14th, our president will be 74, and our flag will be 243 years old. I wanted to give a little mystical background to the foundation of the United States, which we'll be celebrating soon on July 4th. If you look at the dollar bill and look at the back of the dollar bill, I have a project for you. See how many 13s you can find. You will find many 13s there. One of them is the expression e pluribus unum. The Latin expression e pluribus unum. It's 13 letters. And it means out of many, one. We established a country with 13 states. Pardon me. And this became so important symbolically that when the South attempted to establish its own country, on the battlefield, they had a flag with 13 stars, even though there were only 11 states in the Confederacy. But they were hoping, evidently, that two other slave states would join them so they could also begin their new country with 13 states. In any case, we're all together now, and we have 50 states. But we did begin with 13, and it was out of many, one. Now, our founding fathers knew the Bible well, and some of them, I believe, had studied biblical Hebrew or had some awareness of it. And it is interesting that in Gematria, the number one, echad, aleph is 1, het is 8, and dalet is 4. So echad in Gematria is 13. So it's interesting, and the Jews do make something of that. So that echad, which means one, in Gematria, the numerical value of the word is 13. And so it's interesting. It's a kind of mystical background to the United States that we were one out of 13 states. And I don't think that was lost on some of our founding fathers who I think had background in that kind of information. Today I want to do a second in this series on the major prophets. So this is series on the major prophets part 2. Today I'm talking about the prophet Jeremiah. Very influential figure in the history of God's people. He lived from about 650 to about 580. He was an important figure in the reforms of Josiah, but he also lived to see the decadence of the nation and prophesy about its doom. And because he often prophesied of doom, we have the expression Jeremiad, where somebody is talking about gloom and doom. And he was also traditionally the author of Lamentations. But I want to say more about the positive side of Jeremiah in a moment. But let's look at his significance. For example, in the New Testament, Jesus says in Matthew 16, he asks this question. Let's go to the 13th verse. We're in the northern part of the land of Israel now, a place that at one point was called Banyas or Paneas, Caesarea Philippi. It's called here around the source of the Jordan River. I have had the opportunity of swimming in that area as in my youth. Verse 13. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. So you see, Jeremiah is a name that came to mind. Here is a great miracle-working teacher and teaching great thoughts and teachings, and Jeremiah's name comes to mind. And in the second chapter of Matthew, we see a prophecy of Jeremiah when Herod slaughtered all of those innocent children, trying to destroy the Christ child. We see a prophecy of Jeremiah quoted there, and I'll talk about that prophecy as I have time later on today. So I do want to go to the positive side of Jeremiah. Yes, Jeremiah prophesied about the destruction of the sinful kingdom in which he lived, but he also prophesied of the future and of its restoration, and he prophesied of the millennial days, the messianic period, and so he was the prophet of hope. And I want to go to Jeremiah 17, a beautiful verse that I believe I talked about a few weeks ago in the morning. Here is Jeremiah 17:13. He says, "O Eternal, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be ashamed. Those who depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Eternal, the fountain of living waters." And here is a play on words, because here God is called the Makor, the source, or the fountain of living waters. But the word mikveh, which can mean hope, in fact, when the Jews began returning to the land of Israel in the 19th century, one of the early settlements was called Mikveh Yisrael, the hope of Israel, from this passage. But a mikveh is also a collection of water, of living waters, coming from a stream, and then the waters are collected and they're used for purification. What they call in Hebrew, in English, a ritualarium, a mikveh, like a baptistry. So God was both the hope of Israel and the purifier of Israel. It's a kind of play on words here. So you see God as the hope of Israel, and then in Jeremiah 31, that very famous prophecy, which of course speaks of tragic times, but yet it also ultimately speaks of hopeful times. I want to go to Jeremiah 31, and speaking about the weeping of Rachel. In verse 15, now here we have in Jeremiah's day an invasion of Judah, and the northern part of Judah were Benjamites, and some of the Benjamites had been carried away with the lost 10 tribes, but there were others who remained with Judah in the south, and then they were carried away in the captivity of Judah. And Paul was of the tribe of Benjamin, so some Benjamites remained in as part of the Jewish nation, and others became part of the lost 10 tribes. So that was the immediate reason for this weeping of Rachel. Rachel is the mother of Benjamin, but it goes beyond that, and the region where she died, Bethlehem, that area, where she is buried. There's a traditional tomb of Rachel there to this day, Kever Rachel. But what I was going to say was that this prophecy projects into the future, and that area around Bethlehem, where, as I said, where Rachel is buried, she is weeping metaphorically for the innocent children who were murdered by Herod. And so you have that prophecy in Matthew 2. So I'm now reading in Jeremiah 31:15. Thus says the Eternal, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Now notice, though, continue. Thus says the Eternal. Remember, although those children were murdered, the attempt was to destroy Jesus Christ, and he failed. Jesus Christ, as you know, escaped, came back, and conducted his ministry successfully. Thus says the Eternal, refrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your works shall be rewarded, says the Eternal, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. Yesh tikvah, there is hope. The Israeli national anthem is called HaTikvah, the hope. There is hope in your future, says the Eternal, that your children shall come back to their own border. V'shavu vanim ligvulam. Your children shall come back to their own border. And now that I have made that comment, I also would like to correct a statement that I made last week, just to quote correctly Proverbs 10:7, Zecher tzadik livracha, the memory of a righteous person is blessed, or is for a blessing. I kind of paraphrased it last week. That's the exact Hebrew. And I quoted the Hebrew here because it's become very popular in the Jewish community. There is hope in your future, says the Eternal, that your children shall come back to their own border. So as part of the return of Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, also as a part of that is the restoration of the people of Israel to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, to serve to serve as a model nation to help convert the world. This is their destiny ultimately. So Jeremiah, as I said, is also a prophet of hope. Let's go back to the beginning of Jeremiah. You could say that his name means the Eternal will exalt. The Eternal will, or exalted of the Eternal. But if you, a little bit of linguistic legerdemain, it could be in a secondary meaning, the Eternal will cast them off, or throw them away, or shoot them away, as it were. So you have to twist it a bit, but not too much, to have that kind of a meaning. And I think there's something to that. See, Jeremiah was there to forecast the doom of the nation, but he was also there to forecast the resurrection of the nation, and even to play a part in that. He himself did play a part in that. He even bought some property, as a sign that the people would return. And so he was both a symbol of the raising of the nation, R-A-Z-E, raise the city, R-A-Z-E. But he also was the prophet of the raising up of the nation, R-A-I-S-E. Okay, so raising and raising. He saw the destruction of his nation, but he lived to see the first stages in the resurrection of his nation. At the end of the book of Jeremiah, there is a statement regarding the king of Judah, who was a captive, who was finally given a certain degree of prestige, and this is like the first step in the in the resurrection of Judah, somewhat of an encouragement, and this may have been in the this may be something that occurred actually after Jeremiah's death, that is recorded at the end of the book as a kind of final appendix here. But Jeremiah himself did prophesy of the restoration of his people and of a 70-year period. In the 25th chapter, I believe you'll find a 70-year period talked about. 609 to 539 was the rule of the Chaldean Empire, and then or the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Then the Medo-Persian Empire takes over, and the Jews are allowed to return. And Daniel, in studying that material, as you know from the book of Daniel, he saw 70 years of captivity and then restoration, and he began to pray, and God revealed many prophecies to Daniel. So Jeremiah was a prophet of hope, as I said, as well as a prophet of doom. Doom for destruction, and yet ultimately restoration, as God's plan is fulfilled. He was a priest who lived in the territory of Benjamin, the city of Anathoth, which was in the territory of Benjamin. He was a priest, and there was a younger priest influenced by him, Ezekiel, who went into captivity and had a great role to play in the restoration of Judah after that period of 70 years. The fact that they were able to come back, the work of Ezekiel was important in that restoration. Here we go in the beginning of the book. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. So what I'm trying to say here is that Jeremiah had a unique role. He saw the destruction of his people, and yet at the same time he was instrumental in terms of beginning the restoration process. And in a sense, there will come a time when God's church will have that role. It will have the role of, yes, warning warning the world of the coming punishment, but at the same time it will have a role in preparing for the second coming of Christ and the great blessings that will come with that. So it will be there for the raising of the cities, and then for the raising of the world when Christ returns. Anyway, to number 2, verse 2, to whom the word of the eternal. So let's start again, verses 1 and 2 of Jeremiah. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the eternal came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. And, there's a lot of that background in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and in the book of Jeremiah itself. Then the word of the eternal came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. So a very special role for this prophet. And that's one reason why he's a major prophet, 52 chapters. Ah, Lord eternal, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth. He was, of course, very humble. But nevertheless, even as a young person, he had a very important role to play. And unfortunately, he was a prophet who had to suffer great persecution from his own people, oppression from his own people. And actually, it was the Gentile enemy that had respect for him. If we have time, we'll get into that. So he was actually more respected by the enemies of Judah than by the people of Judah themselves overall. But then, of course, he did become a beloved prophet over time, as we see in Matthew 16. But the Eternal said to me, do not say I am a youth, for you shall go to all to whom I send you, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Eternal. So, this was his problem, that his own people didn't want to listen. Then the Eternal put forth his hand and touched my mouth, and the Eternal said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. So Jeremiah was very much inspired, divinely inspired in what he had to say. See, I have this day set you over the kingdoms, over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. Oh, a dual role. That's what I'm saying. A dual role. Now, I don't really have time to get into it today, but it may very well be that he played a role in the future history of the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel by bringing into the now I realize that for some people this is very new material, and there are others who are skeptical of it. But there are those who believe that Jeremiah, after the fall of Judah, took one of the daughters of at least one of the daughters of King Zedekiah, and brought her to the British Isles, and married her to a ruler there who was a descendant from the Zara line of Judah. And Zedekiah's daughter was from the Pharez line, thus uniting the two lines. And that ruler ruled over at least a part of what is today called Ireland. That ruling family later was transferred to Scotland and then to England, which was perhaps fulfilling a prophecy in Ezekiel 21. And that is the family that, through various, you could study into it, but that is the family that is ruling over the United Kingdom today. And so, according to that scenario, what we have today is a ruler, in this case Queen Elizabeth II, who is a descendant of David. And so we have a throne on earth when Jesus Christ returns as the descendant of David and as the Messiah. He would have in effect a throne to inherit, which would be the throne that rules over the Commonwealth nations. But that's obviously a story for another time. and if it is something you had never heard about before, you can dig into it. I do want to mention that in Jeremiah 43, we do see that in verse 5 that after the assassination of Gedaliah and then the recovery, the Jews drove out the ones who had assassinated him. But then in verse 5 of Jeremiah 43, but Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the captains of the forces took all the remnant of Judah, who had returned to dwell in the land of Judah from all nations where they had been, men, women, children, the king's daughters, and every person whom Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had left for the Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch, the son of Neriah. So he had a scribe, Baruch, who worked with him, and there are legends concerning Jeremiah and Baruch having gone, to Ireland and brought at least one of the daughters of Zedekiah with them to marry a ruler there. But that is something that I realize is more controversial. But in any case, he did prepare Judah for its restoration with the work that he did, with the prophecies that he was inspired to give. And as I said, he influenced then a younger priest, Ezekiel, who prophesied from captivity. And then, of course, he influenced Daniel, who was of the royal line, who was of the tribe of Judah, and who had a secular role as a very powerful influence over the empire. And those two, Daniel and Ezekiel, were very important pillars of God's church at that time, helped to preserve the canon of Scripture and prepare the Jews for their return back to the Holy Land. I'd like to go to Jeremiah, the 10th chapter. And in Jeremiah 10, he's talking about idolatry and condemning idolatry. Hear the word which the Eternal speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Eternal, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them. So don't let people get you all excited about what's going on astronomically. It's of interest for sure, and astronomy is very important. Astronomy is necessary to have a calendar, and astronomy is a wonderful field. The heavens declare the glory of God, but let's not get dismayed or excited or carried away by whatever's going on out there. This is something, unfortunately, that does happen. And of course, there is also the influence of astrology, which is far more powerful than many of us know. Anyway, so he says, for the customs of the peoples are futile, for one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. And then he goes into the discussion of how they make idols. They use wood, they use metal, they make idols. And then I want to go to the 10th verse. So we don't get wrapped up in stars and planets. We don't get wrapped up in physical things. We don't bow down to or make amulets and charms out of physical things. Verse 10, but the Eternal is the true God. He is the living God and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth will tremble, and the nations will not be able to endure his indignation. So ultimately, God is in control, God is in charge, and God is going to establish his kingdom. Y a las personas, a los miembros de nuestra congregación que hablan español, yo quiero decir esto. Why did I do that? I said, to those persons who are members of our congregation who speak Spanish, I wanted to say this. Why did I do that? Because that's what he did. He switched languages. And what he did was in verse 11, he went from Hebrew to Aramaic. Aramaic was the imperial language of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the imperial language of the Chaldeans. And he gives this verse, the 11th verse, in Aramaic, so the Gentiles will understand it. So the armies that are going to come to invade Judah will understand it. And here's what he tells them in Aramaic. Sometimes it's called in old Bibles Chaldee or Syriac. It's the Aramaic language. Thus shall you say to them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. So this is a message everybody needs to know. And so he says it in Aramaic, then he goes back to Hebrew in the 12th verse. He has made the earth by his power, he has established the world by his wisdom, and has stretched out the heavens at his discretion. And on we go. What I wanted to say about Jeremiah, there's a lot of, obviously I wanted to say, I won't get the opportunity to say today, but I want to say this about Jeremiah. In the 31st chapter of Jeremiah, he prophesied about a Brit Chadashah, about a new covenant, which would be the solution to the problem of Israel and Judah. They never were able to fulfill their potential as nations, but under the new covenant, they'll be able to fulfill their potential. And not only they will be able to fulfill their potential, but all the world, every nation, will be able to fulfill its potential. So Jeremiah 31:31 prophesies about the new covenant, and all the way through, to the 34th verse. Very powerful passage, and it's quoted in Hebrews, the 8th chapter, and I believe it's referred to, also in the 10th chapter of Hebrews. But I want to say one thing about Hebrews, what it adds, so that we can understand the problem with the Old Covenant. And I've talked about this before, but who knows who's listening today that may not have heard what I said earlier, and so forth. So let's go to Hebrews 8, and here's what the writer, the author of Hebrews 8 says. He says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault with them," he says. So he quotes Jeremiah 31, and he says, what's the problem with the Old Covenant? Human nature. And human nature is not necessarily intrinsic to people. There's an outside force. There's Satan and demons influencing what we call human nature. That influence will be gone in the millennium. But even before then, there are people who will be given God's Spirit through history, who will have the power to overcome that carnality, and they will be saints resurrected when Jesus Christ returns. And then in the millennium, with that influence removed, the vast majority of humanity will then become a part of God's church. And of course, it begins with Israel and Judah in the millennium, and then spreads to the entire world. So that's some of what you can derive from this book of Jeremiah. It's there's so much here, 52 chapters. So I hope that I've given you at least a theme, a kind of basis of where the book is going. I want to go to Jeremiah 33. Here you again see a prophecy of restoration, and again, because these verses are popular in the Jewish community, I want to refer to them a bit. Thus says the Eternal, again there shall be heard in this place, of which you say it is desolate. Jeremiah 33:10. Okay, thus says the Eternal, again there shall be heard in this place, of which you say it is desolate, without man and without beast. In the cities of Judah, in the seats of Jerusalem that are desolate, without man and without inhabitant, without beast, the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the voice of those who will say, praise the Eternal of hosts, for the Eternal is good, for his mercy endures forever, which comes out of out of the Psalms, or Psalm 118, for example. So here you have this prophecy of restoration, and this passage in a condensed form is sung at Orthodox Jewish weddings. Various melodies for it, very popular passage. But I want to go to another passage that should be very inspiring to Christians, and this is verse 15 of the same chapter. In those days and at that time I will cause to grow up to David a branch of righteousness, He shall execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. So this is a messianic prophecy. In those days Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. And this is the name by which she will be called. The city of Jerusalem will have this title, Yahweh Tzidkenu, the eternal our righteousness. Because here we have the Messiah dwelling in the city, and the Messiah actually is the eternal our righteousness, because we understand that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. So now the resurrected Jesus Christ is an immortal human being, but he's also divine. He's the Logos, and so indeed, he dwelling in Jerusalem, it will be the city of Yahweh, our righteousness. So that is something that ought to be very inspiring to Christians. To everybody, but we Christians can have a deeper understanding of the meaning, because we have the New Testament revelation, and we have an understanding of that Jesus Christ is more than Messiah. He's also Savior. He's both fully human and fully divine, because only God can save us. Isaiah 43. Only God can ultimately save us, and He does so in the ministry of Jesus Christ. I'd like to go to Jeremiah 50 and verse 20. As I said, the nation of Israel, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, ultimately failed in their mission. They could not overcome. As a friend of mine, a mentor of mine, a teacher of mine, a great scholar who not with us anymore, but had a great influence on me. He used to say about the Jews, those who are supposed to overcome the world have been overcome by the world. And this is, of course, the case of the nation of Israel, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. They were to overcome the world, but they were in many ways overcome by the world. But when Jesus Christ returns, he will regather the descendants of the 12 tribes, place them in a very strategic place where Europe, Asia, and Africa come together. The Mediterranean means center of the earth. He'll place them in a very strategic location. He will convert that nation, and as you know from Isaiah 19, they will team up with Egypt and Assyria, which in itself is incredible. That Egypt, Assyria, and Israel will be a triple entente. And from there, of course, the world can be converted in mass. In the meantime, of course, over these millennia, we have the spiritual Jews, we have the Israel of God, we have the universal church, the worldwide church, which is of all ethnicities, as a prelude to the second coming of Christ. And I want to read another very encouraging prophecy from Jeremiah, and this is from the 50th chapter and the 20th verse. In those days and in that time, says the Eternal, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought, but there shall be none. And the sins of Judah, but they shall not be found. For I will pardon those whom I preserve. And of course we know from Acts 10, this prophecy ultimately goes, and from many other verses, this prophecy ultimately goes to the entire human race. We can have, each of us, when we come to that understanding of what is necessary in our lives, which is repentance and receiving of God's Spirit and submitting to the rule of Jesus Christ. Once we understand that, our iniquities are forgotten, and we're on the road towards eternal life. So this is a very important lesson that we can learn from this this second of the major prophets, the prophet Jeremiah. All the best to you and yours.